Howdy, Michael here. Hope you're doing well. Been a long time, but I have been busy and have had to focus on some teaching stuff. Did some IB physics at a school, and then AP calculus and honors pre-calculus at another one. And when you're at a school, when it's your first year there, a lot of new stuff to learn. Besides being in a new city and a new state, all the stuff to learn there, new people, new places, where to get gas, where to shop, what are some great places to hike, getting out and exploring all that, state parks, national parks, all that. But with the school, new students, new teachers, new admin, new people, new procedures, new policies, got to write tests, quizzes, make keys for them, curriculum, lesson plans, all this stuff. A lot of new things to get used to. Second year at a place is a lot easier than the first. But been busy with that. So anyway, education. Education, as we know, is very important. It's essential to the culture, essential in transmitting a good culture. It's essential in forming the kind of culture we want and being less abstract. It's a social cultural institution we have to help our children. Education in general, education can be done on different levels, different ways. But mainstream education here, I think, is broken, has some deficiencies. There are some good teachers out there. So we got to identify what's going on. Some people say education and then make a blanket statement about it. I think that's unethical. They're wrong. Major injustice. People who do that need to come out and apologize. Major error. Major ethical flaw. It's dishonest. People out there who are doing a good job should be appreciated. Should be given extra accolades for the work they do in this culture. If, as some people say, education is horrible, it's rotten, it's so modern education is just wrong and unethical, and then why the hell don't you go to more detail and more depth and take more what's the word I'm trying to look for, like more effort and discipline, and take more of a stand about the people who are doing better. I've mentioned some of those in other podcasts, had them on. I think, some people out there, don't remember all of them, and there's people I know, some friends, who are trying really hard, doing some good work, teachers I've worked with, and, had like Scott Harris on the podcast. There's other people I know out there who I'll talk about in the future, or I've talked about, need to do more of that, about some work some people are doing. And, Scott Powell's out there doing some good work in history, for example, like Scott Harris could say, good work in philosophy. So there's a few. Thank y'all for what you do. And who is it? Don't recall right now. Elizabeth out there doing Grammar Revolution. Doing some good work in grammar, sentence diagramming, all that. There's a few. And, nothing against other people I don't mention right now. Just will in the future have here and there. But just want to make sure I mention some so I don't sound like a hypocrite. But people out there are doing good work and should be recognized and appreciated and rewarded and not attacked and ignored for the sake of some rhetoric. And then if someone wants to say something, then yeah, you can say some principles of mainstream education are wrong. Definitely agree. That's been known by a lot of people for a long time. I think, I forget if it was CBS or ABC. They had a documentary they made about education. It used to be on YouTube, but not anymore. I'd have to dig it up and see. And, there's the books by John Gatto talking about education and his experiences. People have been saying some things about education for decades. There's some trends that show up about 1967 or so, 1964, when a lot of people agree there were some declines in the quality and state of mainstream education. Clearly, if some people say if education was all bad, well, then the country would be falling apart. We wouldn't be where we are. We wouldn't have the cell phone, the iPhone, things like that. There are some very intelligent people, some very well-educated people, creative, rational, wise, Aristotelian, focused on reality, trying to help people live a good life and do good things. If education was so bad, we wouldn't be having some of that. It's an obvious contradiction there. Something good is going on with some people somewhere, But I think we'd agree that there's a lot of mainstream stuff that needs to be improved, and that would help a lot of teachers. There's some out there that want to do good work that can't do the best they want to do, be the best they can be, help students be the best they can be. There's some negative counteracting influences, some bad principles, I think, from like John Dewey, who was a disciple of Immanuel Kant. If you look into John Dewey, you'll see he's doesn't have a good philosophy. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people like him. And in some ways, there's some things in contrast to what someone might think of as some Platonism, like looking at books regardless of the facts. They might think Dewey's good because he offers this alternative. And if you look at it in a rational way, you can get some good things out of him, Focus on experience. That matters in learning. Try to adapt to the world. Have it so each individual student learns and focus on their capacities. Do maybe some projects. But Dewey thought that, being a Kantian, that there was, if you look at what he really said, for Dewey, there is no truth as you think of it. Truth is, quote unquote, whatever works. So if something is a fact and someone actually did something in the past, but it works to say something else, to lie about it, to get something done, well, according to Dewey, then it's true, which is obviously a bunch of nonsense. There goes, a bunch of law. There goes justice, and so on. Dig into what he said, look at that, think about it. You'll see how wrong, unethical, evil that actually is when you actually put it into play. And then, being a Kantian, he would think that truth is social. There is no objective truth. It's whatever society agrees upon. It's like objectivity as a social phenomena. Although there's some contradictions in that, if you dig into Immanuel Kant, see what he said and so on, but I'm not going to get into that much here. Mainly, I wanted to point out how Dewey is not the great philosopher and savior that some people might think he is. You can read it and get some things out of it. Yeah, but, caveat emptor. Or caveat cognitor, if that's a Latin word. Let the thinker beware. Or a Latin phrase, not a Latin word. But there's a lot of things that show education is not what it could be. Even back in 1947, as I've said numerous times, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote an article in the Morehouse College paper called The Maroon Tiger. Morehouse College is where he went to college. The paper was The Maroon Tiger. He wrote for it. He wrote an article. What was it? The Purpose of Education, or The Aim of Education, from like 1947. That's when it was printed, the article he wrote. But, as he even said back then, education should enable one... Wait, not quite. He said, education should enable one to engage in quick, resolute, and effective thinking. Something like that. It should enable one to sift away evidence, discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. I agree. And it should help people have good character. I agree 100%. And that was back in the 40s. And he was noticing that it wasn't doing the job he could. Even, he said, even the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit, in many instances, do not give us unbiased truths. So, and at the end of his article, he says something like, beware teachers, beware brethren, for what you're doing. Be careful. Maybe that was the word. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers, for what you're turning out. You're responsible within your context of authority. We can only do so much. Some people need a job to support their kids. So you got to be contextual like that and not just jump on someone for what they're doing. If you want to jump on them and attack them for the way they're doing it, well, then you support them and support their kids so they can have a voice. Until then, be considerate and be wise, please, as we should be. Figure out context and root causes. But some people say we can improve education. There's things we should do. There's things like we just need more money. There's things like we need to make it fun. Or, someone gives a TED talk and talks about the need for creativity. Or some people say there's a revolution because it's going to be put on internet like some people do who are supported by Bill Gates. They're put on YouTube and they're doing this stuff and it's so great. No, none of those will work. If we look at education as a car that's like a broken car, a car that's not moving anywhere or that's puttering along, barely working, about to stop and fall apart because things aren't working right. Mainstream education, not all of it. Other people are zooming by, doing these great things, inventing new types of vehicles or improved cars, doing good work, but mainstream education, some putsy car, either broken down or going along slowly like a jalopy all wrecked. But, so look at these things. People want to put more money at the thing thinking that'll improve it. Well, no, because you can put a bunch of money into the car, you can put gold rims on, new tires, put a bunch of diamonds and gold on it and all this stuff and all this technology, but until you fix the problem, it's not going to work. The car is not going to do what it needs to do. More money towards the same things that aren't working is not going to help, obviously. And look at the facts of reality. You go back not even go back in time, but around the world right now, there's people who don't have a lot of money, but still can give their children, their students, a great, deep education. Or go back in time. They didn't have the money we did, the same kind of finances, even relatively, but they can give students a great education. All they needed was chalk and talk, Until you put the money into someone who understands cars and the mechanics of them and how they work, it ain't going to get fixed, you know? Or the fun idea. You can have your car that doesn't work or is barely moving along. You can put in a new radio, play the music loud, play good music, laugh, put in new speakers, have fun, put games in the car. Play games while you're going along, like find license plates or whatever, you know. Come up with stuff to do while you're not moving along anywhere and play all these games, but it ain't going to help. The car ain't fixed. It ain't working. It's broke. It's puttering along. That does not help. You know, money obviously is good when invested wisely on things that actually get the job done. And fun is good. It can help us learn things. It can be disruptive. It's unneeded sometimes, but in some contexts, when used properly, it can help. Yes, 100%. But it's not a fundamental. Neither is money. Or people need to be more creative. No, it's not going to help. You can, if you don't understand how cars work, or you want this car to be working in the same way, you can be as creative as you want, but it ain't going to help. Until you know the mechanics of a car, it can figure out how to get it working or improvise a solution like they did in Apollo 13. When you have a deep understanding of reality and humans and the mind and reasoning and what education is, only then does creativity matter. You can teach students to be as creative as you want, but if they can't tie that into cause and effect, into how the world works, into knowledge we already have, into existing technologies and so on, it's irrelevant. No one cares. It's like stuff that's not even real or related to reality or cause and effect. Imagination and creativity are very important, but only when one is first tied to reality. Or some people put stuff on the internet, big deal. You get stuff in books and a teacher's presenting it, this stuff with the poor pedagogy, and someone does the poor pedagogy on the internet, so what? Same thing. It's still defective and deficient. Someone might like watching it presented in a certain way on the internet, but it's still not what we need to do. The car still ain't working. I'd have to think about how to put that in terms of the car. But I think we get the idea. Just like, you know, the printing press allowed people to read, you know, in terms of spreading books more widely. Of course, people can read before then, obviously, but books were more widespread after the printing press. But if you're reading books that say you're irrational and you don't know anything and life is futile, well, you know, to hell with your education, it ain't going to matter. If you got some bad philosophies in there behind it, you know, if how you're teaching and reading, what you're reading, how you're thinking is not reasonable and logical and in tune with reality, it ain't gonna matter. Then you're gonna get a bunch of bored people who are messed up. It's gonna be an anti-education instead of an education. You know? But same thing with putting things on YouTube or the internet in video. If it's not logical and rational and in tune with reality and so on, it does not matter. What we need is to get to the essence of education, which is training young minds for adult life. That, and figure out the mechanics of that. Only then will education reach its potential. And we got to do it like what Galileo and Newton did in physics. physics was in chemistry and the natural sciences were putzing along, not doing much at all for hundreds of years because they were influenced by Plato and Ptolemy, and they were thinking that you use pure reason and experience was not trustworthy or reliable in some way or other. It wasn't a warrant for good thinking. And you can look at the historical record in history and philosophy of science to see that that is true. So, what made Galileo and Newton so effective and how they developed science was that they revolutionized it. They rejected the Platonic principles that people had been following, or other principles that were similar, and put things on a Aristotelian basis. They did that explicitly. Galileo was an expert in Aristotelian logic. He taught it in college, in university, in Italy. Newton himself said explicitly in his rules of reasoning in natural science, in the Principia, the 4 rules, one of them, he said that he mentioned induction explicitly. We induce from observation. And he rejected Platonism and that kind of thing explicitly. Like any hypothesis that you can imagine to the contrary of what we got by induction is to be rejected. So it's a hypothesis in that sense, not a hypothesis developed from facts and reality, which you investigate and see if you can do the reasoning you need to make it an induction. But he's not talking about something like that. He says for this hypothesis, it's something made up like Descartes did or Plato did or some others. And it's legit. Like, so in Germany, Gregor Ohm was a high school teacher, and he discovered Ohm's laws, B equals IR for electric circuits. He got it through experimentation, which you should, as Galileo and Newton did, as Benjamin Franklin did in discovering that all lightning is electricity. But some German scientists, being more in tune with the continental thing, like Descartes, more Platonist, versus some of the English who are more, empiricist. Of course, Galileo was in Italy, more empiricist, Aristotelian, like Newton. But some German scientists ridiculed Ohm because he got it through experimentation, not pure reasoning. They didn't take him seriously. So this is not something I'm making up or that's irrelevant. This is in the philosophic historical record. We need to look at reality as Newton and Galileo did and induce from basic facts principles about learning and education. Then we'll get it right. And when we look into it, we look at education, we see it's about, as I say, training the young to prepare them for adult life, giving them the skills they need. And one of the key skills is using the mind. So we need, what are the mechanics of mind? How do we think and reason? What subjects do we need to know? And people know the subjects pretty well, You need to know history to know about human nature, what people have done in the past, what's possible to us, what we need to do to avoid, what ideas cause harm or injury or roadblocks to human progress and success and happiness, what ideas and principles lead us to happiness and help us live a good life and get along with other people and understand the world. History is a good kind of laboratory for studying human ideas. That's how it should be taught. And of course, we need to know natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, ecology. some social sciences, some psychology. History is related to that. Maybe some sociology, things like that. We didn't know about the world that we live in, the physics, the chemistry, especially nowadays when there's so much technology and science involved in so much of what we do. And it's so much of a part of our everyday kind of modern life. We need to know, that it's lawful and trustworthy and understand some things about it so we can achieve our values in this world. And of course, we need to know math. Math is important in all those other areas: physics, chemistry, economics, finance, health, fitness, exercise, nutrition, because math is a science of measurement, and we have measurement or quantitative relationships in a lot of things. And we look at when one thing changes, how it causes another thing to change. When there's a certain percent increase every year in your salary, how does it cause your income to change? Or, it's like the function stuff that some of you will know for sure, and some of you might remember the function idea in math and science. But a lot of stuff in medicine too, nursing and all that, health, when you drink a certain amount of coffee, how does it affect you? When you do not exercise enough, how does it affect you? When you get some good exercise, how does it help? The more, the better, up to certain limits, it shouldn't be too much and too little. And when we quantify it, it helps us more. And even, studying it and then having general conceptual ideas is important. We don't always use specific numbers and specific measurements and things, but we need to know the general idea to grasp what's being said in medical claims, scientific claims, financial claims, all these other things. Very important. And then math helps us learn how to problem solve and think. Without it, a lot of these subjects, physics, chemistry, all that, ecology, we wouldn't be able to find the cause and effect relationships that we do or understand it as we do. So important. Or if we know about scaling, you can do a better job of giving the right amount of medication to like a kid or a pet. Metabolic scaling works different than strict weight. So if something weighs a tenth of what you do, you don't necessarily want to give it a tenth of the medication. It could be, I forget how the metabolism works, but it could be scaled, so you should give it even less, something like that. You got to be careful about some of that. But a lot of things, we just got to open our mind and think and dig into it, not just think we know everything or we don't need to know it. So many mistakes would be made, would be avoided if people knew better and dug into things more and didn't think they knew it all. If they were, but it's like being more educated. It's not so much an individual's fault. I noticed some of that myself too. I sure the hell shouldn't be expected when I'm a kid to know certain things or to know everything. You probably know some of that yourself. You think, look back and you think, why the hell didn't they tell me this before? Education should be about, as I say, helping the young grow to be a better adult. What do we need to know? How do we need to think? What would make a person, what would allow them to live a better life and get along with other people and thereby make a better culture? A lot to that. So it's not just some academic question. This is very important in our everyday lives. So those are some subjects we need to know. I think physical education should be part of it since we're rational animals. Self-sovereign social animals. That's more what human nature is. Exercise, fitness, training would help us think better, live better, be more focused. It's been proven. A lot of us, I think, know from our own experience, and because of that, people know to study it scientifically, and it's in books like, for example, Spark by Dr. John Rady. That's one you could look at. And no doubt, since that's been written, there's many other research articles and all that. There's also things you could look up on, like TED Talks or on YouTube, people talking about how mind is for movement. So we need to move more to function better cognitively, mentally, have better memory, better attitude, more creativity. So I think fitness should be part of it too. It's so wrapped up in who and what we are. But English, of course, should be part of education. Writing, grammar, reading, that's very conceptual stuff. It helps us learn how to think better, which of course is very important in human life. Language, literature, maybe some, and like in literature, then you got a conceptual art. Those are the main things. But in the mechanics of it, what we need to do in all those things is get a good epistemology behind it, good logic. It's not just like classical education. That is not the best system. It does some good things, but it's teaching you to just look at what people have said in the past, which is very important, and we should look at that. Very important thing. You can learn a lot from that. It's made some great minds, but not as good as they could have been. When you're looking at classical stuff, you're looking at some of the great ideas in history, and you can see which ones are right and which ones are wrong. As I said, now that some of them have been written hundreds and thousands of years ago, so we can see how these ideas have played out and whether they are actually good or not. Like Platonism and science, or Plato's ethical and political ideas, how the effects they've had through history and politics and human well-being, or Marxism and communism. What is that really about? What did they really say? And what kind of effects did it have? So some things, when they're first written, someone might make an excuse that, we didn't know, but now there's like no longer an excuse for some things. We should know from history the necessary consequences that some ideas have, some basic principles. But classical education doesn't do enough when it's done like that. When that's the essence of education, it doesn't really help one learn how to think on their own. What's used in classical education can be used in a good education, but teaching someone to study the classics as if that's all there is not a good method. So part of it is how this stuff is used. But the focus should be in the mechanics of the mind need to be understood to figure out what should be done in a good education. Then we can do the things that aren't being done with money, fun, creativity, putting it on the internet. Those are not fundamentals. Those are superficial. They're not going to change the essence of what's going on. When you get to the essence of human thinking, of education, of human life, human nature, then you can have a good educational system. People need to figure that out. Like I say, I think we live in a rational world. We are self-sovereign social animals. There's a lot to us. Physical, mental, emotional, social, individual, cognitive, spiritual, in a sense. We have a lot of different aspects. And, the thing education can deal with is how we use our mind and come up with what we need to know. Because it shouldn't be about brainwashing or control. Education's about helping someone, some self-sovereign social animal with dignity, helping them learn how to think so they can be a strong, independent individual. They can be, because we're social animals, we should help them be a strong, independent, contributing member of the tribe. We all like friends and stuff like that, There, I think, are some metaphysics of man and metaphysics of reality that'll help. We live in a world of cause and effect. It's not a Platonic world, a Kantian world, a John Deweyan world. We have a world of objective, world of identity and cause and effect. We are self-sovereign social animals. And the thing that we need to work on, as I say, the thing that kind of needs training, people have found through experience, through hundreds of years, the thing that needs to work, we need most training in, is how to use our mind. What mental content do we need? What concepts to understand the world and move through it when we're adult and be the best we can be our best and help others the most. And what methods do we need? And there's a key thing there too. So if we really want to fix education, I think there's where the real key lies. Besides getting human nature and reality right, we need to get the proper methods of thought. And so people can do a better idea of breaking down content and seeing how they're going to develop it through the years. Do different grades or different levels of learning. Because, you can't always judge by how old someone is, what they know, what they've learned, how fast they can learn and all that. It's on an individual basis. There's a lot of individual variation amongst us. We're all exactly the same in our nature and in principle, but within that nature, there's a whole hell ton of variation. Many dimensions we vary on. There's a lot of dimensions we have, a lot of variation within each of those dimensions, complex and complicated and all that stuff. But, different weight, different heights, different intelligence level, different interests, different discipline levels, different hobbies, different values, all these things, and different degrees in how some of this stuff interacts. Discipline with intellectual level, with determination, and so on. We are multifactorial. There's a lot of factors that go into causing things when it comes to being a person. We're not simple. But some of the methods we need to look at to see how to kind of structure things are things about logic and epistemology. And I do not mean logic in the sense some people think in a Platonic sense or an anomalist sense. So I don't mean it's not merely dealing with words or empty symbols as anomalists might think. It's not principles divorced from experience as some Platonists might think. It's not deduction separate from reality. It's not symbolic logic, stuff like that, is some people's conception of logic is, unfortunately. Logic is, as Aristotle discovered, logic is the art when practiced and the science when studied. It's like the art and science of, or I should say, logic is the art or science of making sure concepts and ideas, propositions are connected to reality, making sure they're true. That's the essential thing about it. It came about through human reasoning. Look back through millennia, people had things they needed to do in life, and look back at the beginning of human development in evolution in history when people didn't know much. And they had to start forming concepts of things that were important to them so they could communicate them and think about them. They wanted to think about them on their own. They wanted to think about them with other people. They wanted to work on these things with other people. So you had these concepts that came up that were developed, concepts and propositions in farming and animal husbandry and finance and economics and counting and mathematics and building and machinery and so on. And then people had to figure things out in social context and politics and ethics. People had to form all these different concepts. And they'd have to see if they're right or wrong. One person says one thing, another person says another. Well, how do we see which one's right? How do we see what actually works, what's true to the world? Or people get to a more advanced state, so they're living in society and they're debating, and they have these debates in ancient Persia or ancient Africa or ancient Greece, ancient China, about what kind of society we should live in, who should be the next ruler, and they got to figure out who they think's right or wrong, make choices, and besides science, people are developing wisdom, and they got to learn to evaluate claims and evaluate arguments. So they're developing logic, and then finally, in ancient Greece, being at the nexus of a bunch of different cultures, having all these influences they had to decide upon, instead of being like up in England at the time where they didn't have many cultural influences on them because they were on this island. In ancient Greece, you had all these different cultures. They had to decide this god, this habits, these habits, this food, that food. People are saying all this stuff. What should I believe? In ancient Greece, Plato developed philosophy. It was like the systematization of wisdom. Wisdom was known around the world, a lot of places. There were a lot of wise people, but Plato was the first one to really systematize kind of wisdom, philosophy, a love of wisdom. That's what it means etymologically. A commitment to truth, in other words. And Aristotle developed logic at the time. Since he had philosophy for a context, and he knew there was the science of geometry developed, he was the first one to see, whoa, all human reasoning is like a geometric proof in the sense of you have to have a starting point. You cannot reason without a starting point. They saw that in arguments and stuff. There was a lot of evidence he had so we could make this induction. Politics, debates, arguments, philosophy, physics, mathematics, all this stuff. People talking about ideas, seeing what's right, what's wrong, all this stuff. Debating, arguing. You saw in this context that all human reasoning is like a geometric proof where you have to have a starting point. In geometric proofs, you have to have some given stuff, given information, establish context, a diagram, then you can start reasoning out your conclusion. And so the evidence of the senses perception was, Aristotle knew, the given, the starting point for all human reasoning. That's identified by Galileo and Newton. That's why Newton said, experience comes first, and we generalize from that. We use induction. Galileo himself said, Nothing is so certain in Aristotle as that all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience. St. Thomas Aquinas said, there is nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. Nothing true in the intellect, in that sense. As opposed to maybe imagination, or wherever he would say misinformation or lies go. But they're all in the Aristotelian tradition, and it's from Aristotle that they got that idea. He was the one that discovered logic, because he's the one that identified that principle of where it starts. And then he developed deduction very much, because that's what was known more at the time. It took a while more for people to do science and form some good inductions so people could see, and then in turn study it and see, what is its nature? You can't study induction until you have something to look at and study. You can't first study something you know nothing about or don't understand and then develop rules about it and then go forward and do it. Not possible. That's ridiculous. You got to have inductions that are valid and then start to see, okay, wait, why are they valid? What are their characteristics? What's going on? Kind of like what Aristotle did with deduction. So we got to look at education as Galileo and Newton did to physics. We got to look at things in terms of experience and develop things from there. And that's some of the mechanics we need. We need some of that in curriculum and in how things are developed. Start from experience, develop inductively from there, as they did. It's how we form concepts, how we form inductions, and then we can put things together. We can't do any deduction until we have induction. Induction forms a generalization. Deduction uses generalizations on particular individual things or connects one generalization to another, as long as you don't go any more abstract than what they already are, because that would be more of an inductive thing, not deduction. All men are immortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you're applying a generalization to a particular thing. Or let's see. I'd have to think about something. I don't have anything right now on the top of my head about others. But there's some times where you you could say, all masses are pulled in orbits around another mass when the latter one is larger. Maybe something like that. And then moons are masses that go around another one. Therefore, moons are pulled in by gravity around another body. We could reformulate that to be correct. I was kind of thinking about it as I was going, so sorry about that. But, you get the idea. So a deduction doesn't necessarily apply to a concrete individual thing, like all men are mortal applies to Socrates. But it could apply to one generalization worked with another to make a third, all things that rotate around a larger body are pulled by gravity into orbits in the shape of conic sections. So all things pulled by a larger body, all things are affected by a larger body by gravity to go in orbits that are conic sections. Moons are small bodies around a planet. Therefore, moons are pulled by the planet in gravitational orbits to go in, are pulled by gravity to go in elliptical orbits around the planet. So notice it's not particular as for Socrates, it's still a general idea. It's just less general. Or all men are mortal. Engineers are men, therefore all engineers are mortal. It's not a particular thing, it's still general. But it's a deduction. So then I think people should also be learning some rules of definition, rules of classification, by doing it first. They could, and at an age-appropriate level. So here's some of the mechanics of mind, and mechanics of reasoning that we need to structure curriculum, structure teaching, and then do it in different ways. You don't got to use induction first because induction forms generalizations. When you get to a higher level, at first I think you want to do some of that. Elementary school, you got to stay tied to the perceptual more. That's the way the students are. When you get older students, high school, college, then I think you can give them an idea and make them do the inverse of induction. The inverse is reduction. So instead of starting with facts and developing up, as Benjamin Franklin did, to all electricity is lightning, he had to know all these different things about the light some things make, the light they don't, the source of the light, the color of the light, color of things, speed of people, horses, light, all this other stuff. And have all these concepts made in classifications and generalizations from experience, know about how some things live and some things die and the ways they can die, and how it can be with plants and animals, and how they're affected by rocks and arrows and knives and bullets and axes and stuff. He's got all this stuff in his experience, versus like how lightning hits a tree and throws the bark off and has a big streak down the side, or kind of tears something apart. You got all these like wounds and destructions and harm done to something versus this kind of harm. That's kind of what I'm talking about. All this stuff is to be developed. He looked at speed of things, color, stuff can pass through water. What can pass through water? Why? Why not? In what way? You got dolphins and fish going through water versus electricity going through water. He had to have all this background knowledge to really make sense of that, to know that the way lightning goes through water and the way electricity goes through water is similar to each other and different than the other stuff. Without the contrast, you don't have the grounds to know that it's the identity of this thing, not the other things, that matters. It's the identity of something in electricity and lightning, not the identity of merely going through water that matters. It's the nature of things and their measurements and their cause-effect relationships and all this background knowledge. It's really amazing and fascinating and awe-inspiring what we do to form an induction. But Benjamin Franklin went through and listed all these different characteristics, like some of those and some more. And then he had to know about electricity, the Leyden jar, how electricity works, all these different phenomena, know it from experience, know its movement, some stuff about how it worked in contrast to other things. All this knowledge built up through decades of life experience and doing science. That was brought into doing the induction. There's a lot there. So you get that, then you can do a deduction using that stuff. But there's a lot of classification, concept formation, similarity and difference and contrast going on. Those are important too. Knowing how to form a good concept, how to get a good generalization, a good induction, how to get good thoughts so you can build upon those and have others that are true. That's how induction would work, building up from the basis, all these like lower level generalizations and concepts to ones that are more abstract than that, to more abstract, to all lightning is electricity. But that's one way to do it. But when you're younger, when you're older, you can go the reverse. All lightning is electricity. How do we know that? And so you might think, oh, because of like light travel, like because electricity can travel in the wire, in a wet string. Well, how do we know it can travel in a wet string? Because it can travel in electric wire and a wet string and stuff like that, and it doesn't travel in these ways. And if we get a dry wire, it doesn't go through it. And if we get a wet wire but nail it to the wall, it doesn't work because there's the drain from the metal nails and so on. And you got to know about static charge in the first place. And then you got to know electric shocks and things like that. And that's just a general idea. That's not every single step, but you could start with the general idea, and reduction is going backwards. It's like reverse engineering the induction. What do we need to know that? So Newton had a list of things. Franklin had a list of things that he knew before he did the kite experiment. Okay, well, how did he know those? What did each one mean? How do we know that electricity and lightning go really fast, and why does it matter? Who cares? Why does that help us? Why is that significant? Why is there a similarity? Like, in contrast to what? Different to what? What are all these things we needed to know before we know, whoa, the speed, the particular speed they have, that's important. That's important knowledge. How do we know? It's not just, oh, they're fast. Like, what if everything's fast? Like, how fast? It's like horse, like sound, light. How do we know? Light versus how fast electricity goes. How do we know it matters? How do we know it's different? Or sound. Sound's really fast. How do we know? It takes a lot of experience. There's a lot of classification and concept formation and thoughts wrapped up in this prior to it, And you got to know about, what is movement in the first place? How do we figure out what movement is? How do we figure out that there's things to move? You got to go back to that basic level if you really want to dig into this entirely. And of course, when you're teaching a kid, you don't got to go through every single step. You wouldn't, it's too much, but you got to show some of the essential steps. But like I say, you can go with an older person who has knowledge to work with already. You can reverse engineer the induction. When they're younger, they can't do that. They don't have the context, the concepts, the ideas, the thoughts to reverse engineer much of anything. It's only when we're older that we can do that. And then we could be doing a reverse engineering and figure out, oh, there's a concept or thought we don't even have. We need to form that concept, form that generalization in the first place. But something like that could be done a little bit with older students. Or you could maybe deduce something instead of inducing it, and then have them induce it on their own, have them thinking about it. But if they're educated better, they'd be kind of doing that by habit anyway, on their own. To do it deductively, they'd be going, how do I know individually on my own? They wouldn't be necessarily asking themselves that. It'd just be some kind of habitual mental state they'd have to try to figure it out. If they had time, of course, and depending on how much interested they really are in that subject, because we can't do everything. We're limited and finite. We're not omniscient. There's only so much we can do. We got to focus on certain things. Invest our time, energy, and all that. But those are some of the mechanics of things we could do. In like you take the idea talked about there in physics with all lightning is electricity. Think about that in history, chemistry. Get the same kind of process, but apply it to different facts and ideas and concepts. It helped a lot in English when you're learning words. The focus should be on learning concepts and not just words. A lot of that, the way it's done, the way I did it a lot in school, was just useless. You get a word you're given, a so-called vocabulary word, you look it up in a dictionary and you write down other words next to it, and then you try to use it in a sentence. But that's not forming concepts. It's not very helpful. It should be taught so that you're forming concepts. Okay, you have this word like fury or anger, capitalism, socialism. So we should, when doing some vocabulary, work on what are examples of it, and then how is it defined, and in contrast to what, like you get, what is that? Like alliteration. And then you get some examples of it. Like there was one, what is that movie? Forgot right now. But there's one movie where someone uses one letter a lot. Sorry. Not a very helpful example since I don't remember the movie or the long quote, which is a bunch of alliteration in it. But if we get maybe I'll try to put it in the description field if I remember later, maybe a YouTube clip of the guy saying this, or I'll link to the movie quote so you can see for yourself. But, Peter Piper played, use the same letter again. You got some alliteration. So instead of looking it up and putting a word string next to it, we should get examples and then see it's a way we do something in language to make a point or stress something. So it's a literary or rhetorical device. That's the kind of thing it is. And then in contrast to what are some other literary devices? Looking at alliteration alone, you're going to forget it. It doesn't make sense. It's not tied into other stuff It's not developed and learned in a way where you can actually use it in your own writing and things like that, in your thinking. It should be this particular fact of reality in contrast to these others. So you got, you can do something in rhetoric or speaking with using the same sound again and again. Or you could rhyme, or you could look at the part is representative of the whole, like the hand is representative of a person, and you got synecdoche. And then if you think of something as if it had human characteristics, and you got personification, so you get these other things that are in contrast to alliteration, then it makes more sense. Oh, that's why we need this concept, because there's these other things we use that I can use that can make my writing and talking and speech and my text messages and emails better. I can use these sometimes. There's alliteration. It's a literary or rhetorical device. And that's an aspect of language. So then we're actually forming concepts. And then we have a method we can use in other areas of life. In forming a concept in physics, chemistry, history, mathematics, economics, fitness, whatever. Whereas if you just get a word and look up a word string next to it, you get turned off to dictionaries and language and concepts. You don't learn what's really going on. Kind of boring. But when you're looking at how concepts are formed implicitly, with the similarity, these things are similar. Oh, we're using the P sound. We're using the R sound. It's a different sound, but it's still alliteration. There are these differences within the similarity. Using the same sound is a similarity, even though the sounds are different, but it's in contrast to like a rhyme in a poem or personification or something like that. You got similarity and difference coming into play, contrast, context. We don't form alliteration in context of studying physics or doing fitness, obviously, or mathematics. It's in context of language. So these things would help us, as I say, this habit of mind would help us in other areas, forming concepts. There's the mechanics of thinking. There's things we need to do to make education better, to improve the quality of life of students, our children, the young, make a better culture. Do things like that with vocabulary. If you see how concepts are formed and you apply that to vocabulary, it can be much more interesting and we can get much more out of it. So we can do things like that in physics as well. Like I've used that with projectile. A lot of people don't get what a projectile is. But if you say, oh, look, these things are similar versus these others, similarity and difference. You got the similarity and the contrast. If you just drop something versus if you knock it off a table, you shoot a bullet, you shoot a cannonball, you fire an arrow, you throw a rock. These things, it's going sideways and being pulled down. If you just drop something, it's only going down. If you have a airplane, there's something different going on than when you flick something off a table, or a guided missile, something like that, or a person running, or a horse running. There's something different going on. So you see the differences, the contrast helps you focus on the similarity of these things that seem different and see how they're similar in some ways. Then you got projectile motion. Then people can understand it better. I've seen that a lot in working with people who don't get some physics involved, but when you use principles about how we form concepts and let them actually form the concept of principle and get propositions in doing so, there's a lot of implicit knowledge there, then they can work with it a lot better. It's amazing and beautiful, and I love it. And that can be done with other things, and chemistry and history and all that. So there we see how working on some of the mechanics, when we know more about the mechanics of mind and reasoning and logic, we can help put that into education and help people a lot more. So like I say, again, to repeat, we need concept formation, induction, classification, definition, and then deduction and argument analysis. Some of that done implicitly in school would help. As a start, kids already do it to some extent. You say something, why? You say something, why? You say something, why? They want connection, they want reasons, they want causality, and ask them that when they're doing stuff. It's what I do as much as I can. Someone says something, well, why do you think that? Make them think. A simple thing like there. All you have to do is ask why once, never mind like 2 or 3 or 5 times. You don't always got to get to a root cause, but asking why gets them to think. And then that can be developed into just, if you think just asking why, that gets them to think, pulls things out of their memory, but questions in general do. That's one thing that should be taught, I think, to make education better, to help our students think better all through life. Ask and answer questions, not just of other people, but they need to do that in their own mind. As an African proverb says, if you want to really understand, learn to put a question. I forget the exact proverb, but it's something like that. Learn to put a question. Very important. Learn to ask and answer questions, to drive a reasoning process, to direct your thinking, to pull things out of your memory. If students would learn that, they do much better on SAT, ACT, homework, things in life, all that. A lot of times I've found it's interesting, students already know stuff when they're asking me. They don't need new knowledge, new concept, new understanding, new principles. All I do is ask them some questions and get them to pull it out of their memory on their own, make the connection on their own, and they got it. A lot of times they already have all the knowledge they need. They just need to put it together. They need a way to do so. They need to use the mechanics of mind and mechanics of reasoning. They need to learn how to use questions. Very important skill. I need to work on it more too. But in addition to like logic, another thing to do is, as I say, ask and answer questions independently to get knowledge. And then once you got that going, asking someone else a question puts it in a whole different light, and you got more knowledge and more cognitive connections going on to help you make more sense of it. And then like a lot of times you'll find if someone asks and answers questions on their own, they don't need to ask someone else a question because they already know. But of course, there's times where we need new input, new particular things, new individual things to form a concept of. We need to see, how do we form this concept? What's this general idea? What's this argument? It's something we need new knowledge for and couldn't necessarily do ourselves with what we already know. So maybe questioning would help if you take time to discover some things, but in a context where you need to know more quickly, asking someone else would be very important. And then we should learn how to understand something. That's another part of mechanics of mind, mechanics of reasoning and logic that we need. Students should know what it is to understand. Not really, they shouldn't think, oh, I got a good grade, so I understand. They should have more of an understanding of what understanding is. Because they're not going to be graded in things in life, at work, and so on. They need to know on their own. They need to know, what do I need to do to understand this concept of work? Or what do I need to conceptualize and put together and connect? What ideas do I need to connect in this thing I'm interested in fitness, or doing something, building something with people, or doing some martial art, or doing some sport, or doing some chess club? How can I make this better? What can help all of us get out of this book club way more than we have been so far, you know? If they know more about what understanding is, they can do that. And I think understanding, one thing you could do is like the Feynman method. And after you have a certain amount of knowledge, you can't do this at the beginning because you don't have anything to understand yet. But when you have a certain amount of knowledge, you could sit down, as Feynman would, with a piece of paper and try to explain it to yourself from basic principles. If you look at, and I don't mean basic principles in a Platonic sense, I mean starting from more the evidence of the senses, from lower level abstractions. What do you need to know, and how would you put it together to get this new idea? So, as I've heard some people say about understanding, some philosophers, what understanding is, and when you know you have it, is you can reduce an idea back to the evidence of the senses. Like, lightning. All lightning is electricity. You can, the essence of a thing. What is its nature? What is it to be a human being? What is it to be a chair? So you got to see, how did I get this idea from perception? And what's the essence of this thing? How do we define it? What's the essence? What's the basic principle of this proposition? And then a key thing about understanding is connecting an idea to other things you know. That's crucial and key to understanding. The more connections you have, the more the depth of understanding. As you can see, understanding can come in degrees, different intensities. You could have more or less of a reduction back to reality. You can have more or fewer connections to other things you know. They can be, it can be to superficial things or deeper things in thinking. You know, like Galileo and Newton showed some understanding of science and physics that other people hadn't before the time, because they connected it to thinking and induction, into logic, into the real world in a way that no one had before. That's why Galileo and some others engaged in a radical revolution in science, because they put on an entirely different philosophical and epistemological foundation how to do physics and what it was, you know. But understanding can come in different degrees, and those three things can help you see if you understand something, and that can help you maybe do the Feynman method more. But you can just think about explaining things in the Feynman method. You know, again, there's differences in degrees in understanding. We have only so much time, only so much effort, and so on and so forth. And you can work on understanding something slowly through years. You don't got to do it all at once. Do a little bit on your own. Work with some other people who are interested in that idea. Do a little bit more on your own. Get back together through a number of years. You know, from what I heard, it took Kepler. It took him maybe 6 years or so, 2 years, 6 years, a long time, to figure out that the planets go in elliptical orbits. Everyone was so fixated on a circle, they couldn't get out of that idea. And there was some other stuff, you know. So to be the first one in human history to identify that planets go in elliptical orbits was difficult and revolutionary, and it took him a long time. It took him a long time to understand what the actual orbits were. So it's okay. Relax, take a while, do that. Teach children to do that. So those are some things I think we need to do to really get education fixed and make it better. Get into the mechanics of reasoning and logic and human thought, doing the things I mentioned. And there's others, of course. This is not a comprehensive, exhaustive list. It's just some essentials. But that is how we're going to get education improved, fixed, get rid of deficiencies. Then you can do other stuff, you know? Then put in fun where it matters. If you're doing something that's interesting, it doesn't need to be fun. That'd be a distraction. Or sometimes you're focused on something. I'm just doing this. I don't want to have fun doing it. That's a distraction. Sometimes it's good to have fun in things, but sometimes students, children need experience with boredom and tedium and going through certain things, because that's what happens in life. Not everything is fun or interesting. We're all butterflies and rainbows or whatever. You know, I don't like cleaning the toilet. I don't like going through all the work to do my taxes, so on and so forth. There's some things that we have to do, like it or not. We need to get used to that. We need to learn to have discipline and stick to something and work our way through it and get an answer and get done what we need to do. Like Jocko. Some of that's important. So fun will come into play when it's appropriate, you know. Money can help when we when we fund the right things, you know. Then creativity can be helpful. Then you can teach people creativity, and in some ways you already will with questions. But once they have this foundation, then and only then does teaching students creativity matter. Then it can be real. Then it can actually have an effect on their lives. Then it can make them happier, instead of just being some like thing they do that has no effect on their lives and, you know, no material consequences. And it's not really related to how they think or what they do, you know. Creativity is helpful only in certain contexts. Or putting stuff on the internet, then it'll help more. Same old bad stuff, no matter what the form, it's still bad. So I hope that helped. That's what I think we need to do to really fix education. And as I say, Martin Luther King Jr. would agree. some other people through history would agree. I think it's to some extent, like it's kind of like what Maria Montessori did. She did a lot of great work. It's what Margaret Collins, the great educator, did. It's what MLK said we should do. MLK, as I wrote, education should develop good character, and it should teach one to sift and weigh evidence, discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. So, hope that helped. Hope we can improve education and do that. Start on our own, convince other people, go step by step with discipline, spread it, practice it, make a better culture, help our students be better. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, let me know.